Welcome to the Shared Value Initiative's 2020 Speaker Series, Resilience Reimagined. I'm Bobby Silton, Managing Director of the Shared Value Initiative, and I'll be your host today. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Shared Value Initiative, we are a global platform for leaders seeking to use business solutions to help address societal challenges. We were part of an FSG, which is a not-for-profit social impact consulting firm that was co-founded by Professor Michael Porter of Harvard Business School and Mark Kramer. We're so glad all of you can join us today. This is a topic of great interest. We've had over 700 people sign up for this event. So a few housekeeping items before we begin. This session is being recorded and we are webcasting virtually from our home. So if we have any technical difficulties, we apologize in advance. All of you in the audience have been placed on mute and your camera has been disabled. There will be time for audience Q&A, so please submit your questions through the Q&A function. And if you are on social media, please use these hashtags and handles so we can follow the conversation. So today's event is the 8th in a series featuring purpose-driven leaders, and they've been sharing with us their latest thinking. Over the course of this series, Resilience Reimagined has explored in a variety of industries and setting what it means to rebuild systems to be more adaptable, sustainable, and equitable. You can find details of all the Resilience Reimagined events at sharedvalue.org. Today, we're here to talk about the CEO Blueprint for Racial Equity with the co-authors. It was published earlier this year in the midst of the growing demand for greater racial justice in the US. And the blueprint articulates the role of the private sector in creating a more equitable and just society. It begins with a provocative question: how will your company's legacy be defined? We believe the CEO Blueprint is an important and valuable tool with the growing call for racial justice and the fact that the incoming US administration has made racial equity one of its top 4 priorities, underscoring its importance and the sense of urgency in addressing racial injustice. Before we hear from our featured speakers today, I'm pleased to introduce the CEO of FSG, Greg Hills, my boss, who has been a champion of the CEO Blueprint since it was a germ of an idea. And he's here to share a bit about the genesis and to provide some context for the conversation on the panel today. So Greg, thanks so much for joining us and sharing your thoughts and perspective.
Thank you, Bobby, and really appreciate that warm introduction. And on behalf of FSG and the Shared Value Initiative, I want to thank everybody for joining the webinar today on such an important and very timely topic to discuss. And before I pass the baton to my fellow co-authors, Michael, Lakshmi, and Martin, I want to provide a little bit of a context on the development of the CEO Blueprint for Racial Equity. So FSG overall, we've been advising companies on their social impact strategies, including the concept of shared value, for the last 20 years. For the last 7 years or so, we've been on our own racial equity journey. And this has included us working on internal efforts, such as changes in our hiring, our people development, our culture. It has included important external efforts, so our work with clients and partners, essentially how to explicitly include racial equity and anti-racism in our social impact research and advisory work. I can say that we are very much still on that journey and are learning to do this better every day. It's both humbling, but it's also really imperative for achieving equitable social change. So one key element of this journey has been our partnership with PolicyLink over the last 5 years. And we've done a number of things with them, but one of them is partnering on the research and writing on the topic of the competitive advantage of racial equity. This is essentially looking at how companies can use racial equity as a lens to identify shared value opportunities. So we highlighted examples of companies such as PayPal and Prudential and Gap, who have used this racial equity lens to think about the communities of color and the needs and challenges they face and how to design products and services to meet those needs in a way that is developing competitive advantage. So what's interesting is when we finished that work and started talking to companies about the findings, most companies were intrigued, but they didn't really seem ready or willing to go there, if you will. Often when we raised racial equity, folks would respond by saying, oh, let's talk about our diversity and inclusion efforts. But they didn't have much depth of understanding on racial equity specifically, nor was there really much of an appetite to go deeper into that work. So I'm going to rewind the tape a little bit. So about a year ago, in October of 2019, FSG came together with PolicyLink for a planning session. And we really wanted to think about what's the next chapter of this work? How do we continue to build on what we have done so far, but how do we take it to the next level? And in that session, we painted a picture of a different future. We envisioned a future when the private sector used its outsized power in this country to influence progress toward a more equitable nation. We envisioned a future when companies understood deeply this country's long history of systemic racism and the role of government and businesses in perpetuating those systems. We envisioned a future when companies were no longer silent and no longer passive in the face of racist systems. And lastly, we envisioned a future when companies could be anti-racist in their strategies and operations. Again, that was our vision. It was back in October of 2019. You all know what has happened since then. The pandemic has laid bare the dramatic inequities facing people of color in this country. Companies face the reality of their employees of color on the front lines who lack sufficient paid family medical leave and insufficient health insurance, and who, as we all saw, suffered disproportionately in the face of both economic and health crises. And then the George Floyd murder happened in May, which triggered a national awakening on racism, a mainstreaming of the Black Lives Matter movement, and really a reckoning on systemic racism overall. So immediately, as we all saw, companies across the spectrum, they put out statements of solidarity and support, committing to racial justice, committing to change. And of course, we applaud the CEOs and the companies that are doing that, they're speaking out. And at the same time, we also know that most of them are not clear about how or where to start in this process. I know from personal experience that leading a company's racial equity journey, it's not easy. And it really does take a significant amount of time, particularly for folks like myself who have benefited from white privilege. It's both an individual journey and it's an organizational journey. And it's so necessary to be intentional about the steps in that process. So with all of that context, FSG and PolicyLink joined up with Just Capital to develop the CEO blueprint for racial equity. This creates an initial framing for how companies can be strategic and structured in advancing racial equity in their business and in society. So I'm very proud of what we've done with this team as an initial offering in this space. I'm so excited that we have three of my co-authors here today to discuss this in more detail. So with that, I will hand it back to Bobby, who will introduce each of our panelists.
Whoops, I need to unmute, so sorry about that. Greg, I just wanted to say thank you for those powerful reflections and those very helpful words that set the context for the conversation today. Really appreciate you being here. So I'd like to now introduce our speakers so we can get into our panel discussion. So first we have Michael McAfee. He is the president and CEO of PolicyLink. He's a results-driven leader with a devotion to serving the nation's most underserved populations and carries forward the legacy of PolicyLink to realize the promise of equity. Michael is going to be our facilitator today. Martin Whittaker, he is the founding CEO of Just Capital. And prior to that, Martin was the founding partner of Sonnen Capital, an impact investing firm. He was recently named by Business Insider as one of the 100 people transforming business on their 2020 list. And last but not least, we have Lakshmi Iyer. She is a director at FSG and a colleague of mine. Lakshmi is a thoughtful and thought-provoking leader, and she co-leads the racial equity thinking for the firm's corporate practice. So welcome, Lakshmi, Martin, and Michael. So glad we're having this discussion today. We look forward to an informative dialogue. Michael, I'm going to hand it off to you, and I'll be back to close the session. So have a good conversation.
All right. Thank you, Bobby and Lakshmi and Martin. It's good to be with you. I'll just start with a few remarks, and then I'm going to jump into a question to Martin, and we'll just continue the conversation. When we think about this moment, it is an awakening moment for our entire nation. And, Greg mentioned his racial equity journey and what that means for him. But the reality is all of us are on a racial equity journey. I'm on one myself. And so I wanted to signal that it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to not have all the answers. It's okay to not know what to do. This is a moment where if we can just sit with the instability of not knowing what that causes in us, and then join with each other, we'll find a path forward. And that's really what's required in this moment. In the Equity Manifesto, we have a sentence, one of the first sentences starts with, it begins by joining. And we believe that if this nation is going to be a stronger nation, if we're going to realize the promise of equity, that we really do need to join in different and transformative ways. And joining also means that we can see each other's humanity, that we can see the design of systems that cause great harm and begin to do something about them. So I just want to take another minute and just share something about the systems of harm. Racial equity is not about charity. Charity alleviates immediate human need momentarily, but it doesn't give us a chance to expect that on any of the indicators around the social determinants of health that we would deserve to think that they would trend in the right direction. We're not operating at a scale where we can expect that. But when you think about racial equity transcends charity. It is asking us to look at the design challenges of our nation and to improve them, whether we're talking about our democracy and our economy. This has always been an experiment, this nation, and it continues to be an experiment. So we should not be alarmed that we have to continue to try to perfect it. And I really want you to hold that. And I'll give you one really good example that is often hiding in plain sight that we would not see, but millions of people are harmed by it. Take the recent discovery in Florida that the unemployment insurance system was designed to intentionally be difficult to work, to not work, to be hard for folks to access. And they designed that system that way because of that racist trope around the Black welfare queen. Now, if you don't need the unemployment system, you would not know that that was intentionally done. That first we use taxpayer dollars to be unaccountable in that way. But think about the consequence now, the design challenge that has created. We didn't think we would be in a pandemic, and now you've got middle-class whites, middle-class Blacks, middle-class Asians, middle-class Latinx folks, middle-class Indigenous folks, small business owners who, by no fault of their own, need to access that system, and it does not work. And that is just one example all across this country of the systemic problem of racial equity. What starts as an attempt to harm a particular group of people ultimately jumps past that group of people and ends up hurting all of us. And that's why we must deal with it. So I wanted to ground this work in helping you think about, do we see the systems of oppression in communities? Because that is a real world example where we probably would not see it unless we were deliberately looking for it. So that is the work of racial equity, to design a nation that is just and fair. So I'll come back and talk a little bit about that more later. But what I would like to do now is turn to Martin. And Martin, I wanted to ask you a question about the recent rankings that you just put out. Last month, you released the 2021 rankings. And what are this year's headlines from that report? Are companies taking tangible actions, particularly for their employees, to advance anti-racism, anti-Black racism, and to achieve racial equity.
Thanks, Michael, and it's great to be here. Thank you for the chance to be together and to be part of this, and for our partnership overall. It's been just wonderful working with you and learning from you, Lakshmi, our friends at FSG, Josh, others at PolicyLink. And you know, I'll answer your question in a second. I do want to just say your remarks, your personal remarks, and Greg's reflect my own. I think we've all been on a journey we didn't expect to go on in 2020, in many ways. And I hope we come out the other side better for it. You know, that we approach this with an open heart and really try to be vulnerable, as you said, and to be better. And I think that's sort of come through in our work in 2020. It's certainly come through for me personally at Just Capital, for my colleagues, for every company in America. I would wager that is on a journey of one kind or another on racial equity, and on equity overall. So that's the backdrop that sort of underpin all of our work this year. Of course, we spend a lot of time surveying the public on what they think, as well as tracking what companies are actually doing. This year has been, I would say, a watershed year in terms of mindsets. Just either a willingness or a requirement for people to think differently, to take actions they might not thought they would take, to react to situations they never thought they'd be in, and to face discomfort, and to face, you know, extraordinarily challenging circumstances, and to try to work together to create solutions. And I think that, to me, epitomizes what we've seen in Just Capital's work and our rankings and the conversations we've been having with the public. To answer your question directly, you know, the headlines from the work really this year are that Americans are ready for a reset. And of course, you know, that is now happening politically for sure, but it was happening before the election, and it's going to continue to happen. Society expects more of corporate America. Workers are by far the most important stakeholder. We'll talk more about that in a second. Fair pay, living wage, human rights, investing in workers, the ethics of leadership, and diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace were the top issues this year in terms of their percentage weights. Microsoft was the #1 company again. Satya Nadella spoke at our event a couple of weeks ago, talked a lot about these issues. And Microsoft, of course, itself has been taking a lot of actions to address racism and try to be more anti-racist, including its investing in DEI programs, it's doubling the number of Black and African-owned suppliers and other things that they're doing. It's quite a comprehensive strategy. So I would say there is the sort of beginnings of progress. You know, the Business Roundtable, we saw take action, create an initiative, particular initiative for Business Roundtable companies on health, education, and what Business Roundtable companies can be doing. We've seen individual companies take actions. There's a long list of anecdotal things I could refer to. IBM talking about its discontinuation of facial recognition technology. Apple entrepreneurship camp for Black software developers, and PayPal is one of our partners on our financial wellness program, creating I think a $500 million fund for to support Black minority businesses. So there's change happening within the company level, but in terms of the system, you know, I think, you know, we need to continue to push. You know, just anecdotally, I can tell you we are seeing a lot of interest from the investor community in more active, more disclosure, and we can talk about that later in the event. the state of disclosure. It's kind of a sorry state, actually, of disclosure by corporate America on diversity-related issues. Getting that information into the hands of investors who believe that that companies and other investment strategies need to be informed by racial equity data because it relates to performance. That is a narrative that is being created right now. We're in discussions with several investors on that. And of course, that's what we wanted to create with the blueprint. You know, this idea of companies having a strategy that not just looked internally what they could do with within their workplace, what could they do within their communities, and then what could they do with society at large. And I think that's one of the things that we are now working very hard to promote as a blueprint for any company that is serious about taking action as a pathway to more systemic change. So that's sort of where we are. And again, we can come back, Michael, to this question of sort of data and disclosure later on.
Thank you. Thank you. Lakshmi, we know that there's a heightened sense of awareness around anti-Black racism. We've been encouraging companies to think about understanding their past history and how they benefited from racism in America. You know, one of the things we talk about, an important step is to create an audit of what has happened. Why do you think that is important? And what do you do? How would you recommend a group get started with that?
Yeah. Thanks, Michael, for that question. And I'm, as Martin said, I'm really glad to be here and just be in partnership with all of you on this call over the last few years to figure out how companies can advance social equity. To your question, you know, first, maybe I'll talk about like what is my understanding of that and what does it mean. You know, I think the idea of a racial equity audit is really to understand how historic as well as ongoing corporate practices, whether it's in your industry or whether it's your own company, how have they contributed to racial inequity, right? And that might have happened knowingly, intentionally, and sometimes it might have happened unknowingly. But, you know, just like in life, like it's important to sort of identify that problem, acknowledge that problem, name it. Otherwise, it's going to be impossible to move forward. You know, and in terms of, you know, you asked the question about also why is that important, right? And I think it's a very fair question because you can imagine a CEO or someone listening on this call may be like, hey, why do you want me to dig into the past? Contemporary business leaders from today are not sort of solely responsible for that current state of the world. They didn't, you know, invent the concept or construct of race, and they didn't instigate those historical practices of oppression against people of color as an individual. So why should they? But I think the racial equity audit is really important because we all know that racism is very much institutionalized, as you said, Michael, earlier. It's very much in the design of the nation, design of our society all over the world. So, you know, within corporate practices, whether it's in the way products are designed or whether it's in the way products are marketed or sourced, that racism is inbuilt in that process, right? So there are some obvious and explicit examples. So you think about your Aunt Jemima packet, you know, the design of that on the pancake mix box, or you think about, you know, several years ago, Google's AI identifying Black consumers as sort of gorillas. Like those are racist, either some sort of a racism that's embedded in the policy practices, hiring practices, who's in the room, or decision-making processes. And then of the company. And then you also have racism that's institutionalized within the industry, right? So you take an example of, let's say, the pharma or the healthcare industry. And, you know, between the 1930s and 70s, I believe, I think that was a time range, the whole experiment, the Tuskegee study, you know, that was conducted, the Tuskegee Syphilis study, which was basically, and you can Google it, and it was basically the unethical medical experiments were conducted on poor Black men. And the purpose was, say, you know, to observe the natural history of untreated syphilis. Now, what happened was obviously some of the men, you know, had syphilis and some of them did not. They were a control group, but for years they were not told they had the disease and they were not provided treatment. Now, this wasn't caused by a particular company. It was obviously federally supported. But the point is that it was part of our society. It was something that was supported by overall our society's institutions and governance policies not that long ago. And that has influenced the mistrust that Black communities today have in the medical research community, right? And so if you look at any pharma company or healthcare company's website, you talk to them, there's like a lot of efforts in the last, I want to say 2 decades around diversifying clinical trials. It's companies are investing a lot of money thinking about innovative ways to make that more diverse. But without actually taking a step back and looking at this history, acknowledging the history and saying, okay, why that, and acknowledging the fact that one of the reasons for the lack of diversity in clinical trials is, examples like these, and the mistrust has come from there. Without acknowledging that, companies are only going to solve for symptoms, right? So they may give out like travel vouchers or something like that, which is important, but it's not sufficient. It's not addressing that problem of mistrust. So the point I'm trying to make is that's where that assessment and audit becomes really important, to look at existing products, policies, practices, as well as historical products, policies, and practices of your company and your industry. And practically what it means is, we've started doing some of this work together with companies, but I'm sure there's a lot more to be explored. As you were saying earlier, if you don't look for it, you're not going to find it. So I think what it looks like is doing research and figuring out, hey, has my industry contributed to this? Has my company contributed to this? Talking to your employees, right, at all levels, and asking them, how are current policies and practices affecting you? Disaggregating data, looking at pay equity audit, looking at how advancements are happening across race or gender or other identities. Looking at your customers and seeing, okay, who is actually using my products today and who's not using it? Which zip codes am I not reaching and why? So I think that's what an audit looks like. And then taking that information, and then there's a choice that a company has, right? So you can either acknowledge that internally to your employees first, you can acknowledge that externally to society. That requires you to be vulnerable, and then figuring out how to address those issues.
That's right. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm curious, Michael, I don't know, as you were talking about, or Martin, I think you were saying that, Business Roundtable and World Economic Forum, all these different entities are talking about stakeholder capitalism. I'm curious, Michael, what's your perspective sitting on the PolicyLink side on all of that, right? So how do we move companies from advocating for stakeholders beyond shareholders? And I'm curious to hear how you would characterize what's at stake if that does not happen.
Sure. I think the first thing, Martin signaled something that I think is really important. He mentioned this mindset shift or awakening that has happened this year. I think when you think about this work, what has to happen, I put it in a couple of buckets. I use a frame called the person, role, and system frame. And I think the person needs to be activated to do this work. Otherwise, it will not happen. I mean, leadership is essential. And a friend of mine says that the self is an instrument that should be played beautifully. And I truly do believe that when it comes to racial equity. We have to not see this as a burden, but an opportunity for us to improve our nation, for us to improve our relationship with each other. And so I think in that person, we all need to think about the richness and the beauty of our stories, our experiences that make us up, that make up who we are. Think about what we bring to the work, but also think about how they may inhibit our ability to have a more expansive aperture, to see the world more fully. That person is important because if you don't have a real sense of your own stories, your own triggers, your own worldviews, it's really hard to jump into a racial equity conversation absent of that, because you're bringing all of that richness, good and bad, into the workplace. So I really start with the person. And that's why I said we all are on a journey to awaken. For me, it may not be about race, but it sure could be about toxic masculinity. And so that is an important part of being on that racial equity journey as well. And so I need to be thinking about how I was raised, to not cry, to be aggressive, to be rewarded for fighting things that don't serve me well right now. That requires a level of personal work that I need to do so that I can fully join in the workplace. And I need not be afraid of that work. I just need to continue to evolve and get better. The role is also important. You know, I often say the role is simply an HR function. It has nothing to do with those innate gifts within us that need to be unleashed. We can imagine a transformative role when it comes to racial equity. And I'll give you some practical examples. As president and CEO of PolicyLink, I'm already authorized to do something. I can choose to make sure that I don't make a salary more than 5 times my employees. That's my choice. I'm not saying others have to do that. I can make sure that the lowest paid employee actually makes a living wage in the region that they reside in. I can actually choose not to just recruit from the best colleges and universities, what we would call this the most elite ones, but find folks like myself who started off at a state college. So that role is quite powerful. You can begin to put things in motion without needing any more authorization, but what currently comes with your position. And then the last one is being able to put all that together. The person in the role being able to see entire systems, our own internal systems at work, what's working for folks and what's not working for folks. And then ultimately, let's say with our philanthropy, seeing actually how we can actually have better impact if we tweak some things in our philanthropy. So I think we can start this work personally by taking up that person, role, and system frame. And what I ultimately think is this: corporations, whether they know it or not, are on the leading edge of the equity movement. And they're on the leading edge of the equity movement because they know how to do a particular thing that is a skill that is needed more than ever now. That is bending the legal and regulatory framework of this nation to their will. That is what is needed. When I talk about the design challenge, to have that power and influence and the know-how to reshape the laws and regulations of this land so that they benefit everyone, that is the skill that we need. And so if we don't step into this opportunity, we should continue to, I want us all to hold a particular number right now. I want you to hold the 100 million plus. There's more than 100 million folks, that's 1 in 3 people in this country who are economically insecure. That number is only going to get bigger if we don't do the things that we're talking about today. So that is really the challenge, to be able to think about how do we improve the lives of that 100 million and get that number going down? Because if we don't, our markets will be unstable. And if stable markets are a prerequisite to having a healthy economy, we're going to jeopardize that. So that's what I think is at stake here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that, Michael. I was just going to make a comment that to your earlier point about the person, role, and system in our work, and you know this, but like in our work with a lot of companies that we've started already on helping them or partnering with them to really advance racial equity, one of the things that is becoming very, very clear, and this is true even for FSG's journey, right, that the corporate strategy to advance racial equity is only going to be as successful as the personal journey of individuals leading and who are part of the business. And
That's
so it's impossible to work on the strategy without that personal journey and growth. And so that's something it's loud and clear, and it's not about a one-day 101 training, but it's really about understanding what role does that individual as well as the business unit or the company play in the system that has contributed to the 100 million number that you were talking about. So that's just like super loud and clear to me and in our work.
Thank you.
I'll just say, I think that last point on the sort of the economic imperative that exists right now. I think increasingly companies are realizing that that is a very powerful driving force, that investors, especially pension funds, are beginning to see there's, you know, a very strong investment case in a broader sense, especially a longer term perspective on the economic health of the country and the economic health of their, you know, their retirement systems to address these issues. That this is as much a personal journey, to your point, as it is an economic and sort of professional necessity. Mm-hmm. And we've seen that with the work that we've done with the Illinois State Treasurer's Office, for example, Connecticut State Treasurer's Office, pushing for a company to be more, to disclose more. data on their board and their workforce in terms of their diversity. We've also seen other more recent efforts by the New York City controller, for example, really pushing now companies, and companies are beginning to respond. And, you know, I think that is the beginning of a shift in the system. And it's partly a personal journey, but it's also partly a recognition that if this country is going to get back on its feet, if we're going to, you know, make a dent in that mountain of debt that our children and our grandchildren are going to have, that you have to build an economy that works for everybody, where people feel like they have a genuine stake, not cut out, not the economy's for someone else, not that job's not accessible to me. That, I think, you know, is really what is a unifying force. You know, that is a force of healing. It's a vision that creates common interest. And boy, do we need that right now in this country, right? We need something we can agree on. And I think that can be a very powerful vision that unites enough people from all sort of aspects of society, including investment, business, and public policy, you know, that creates some kind of a healing process. So that's where I really feel I feel like there's an opportunity for that right now, and it's one of the reasons why we're pushing that hard at Just Capital.
Yeah. And Martin, we're talking a lot about like person role and systems thinking, all of these things. Sometimes people consider those kind of like soft things in relationship to business, but data has also been important in our work as well. How are you seeing people hold really these two constructs, kind of like that person role and system work with the data work?
So that's a great question. I mean, the truth is that the source of public data, you know, on what actions companies are taking, is pretty sorry right now. You know, we track this as best we can. I can tell you that as of, you know, maybe a couple of months ago, only 4% of companies that we cover in our Russell 1000 universe either, you know, disclose either a full EEO1 report or that data is available somewhere. Intel is the leader, but 60% have no disclosure whatsoever. Mm-hmm. So it's very, very difficult to even get any information. And I think that's really hampering progress, because unless we can start to see, for example, let's take boards, you know, there have been, I saw recent data from, I think it was Board Prospects that were tracking board appointees. Since George Floyd's death in May, there were in the Russell 3000, 130 Black board members appointed. That's what, 5 months compared to 38 in the 5 months before that. Other statistics I've seen from around S&P 500 companies, you know, it's still a tiny fraction. It's less than 10% of directors at S&P 500 companies are Black. And, you know, there are lots of initiatives now to change that, right? To promote board readiness of Black and brown business professionals, so that you know, that number can increase and we can tackle that, you know, in a more systemic way. There are other initiatives like the Board Challenge, you know, to really challenge companies to you know, add greater diversity to their boards. And so you're starting to see progress like that, but the actual data, Michael, is just very, very difficult, as it is across many issues that we measure at Just, quite honestly. Wages, you know, when we polled a lot this year on what should companies be doing on racial equity, including oversampling of Black and brown respondents. And the answer was, you know, always came back to pay a fair and living wage, you know, source from minority-owned businesses in your supply chain. getting that kind of data to see, well, what kind of progress is actually being made? What are companies actually doing? How do we sort of track progress? And therefore, how do we know, whether that progress is being made? Like, what are the set of characteristics that create the chance for progress to be made? So it's not just the scorecard so we can identify winners and losers, or leaders and laggards. Data helps you really understand what you need to do, why things you're trying to do might not be successful. Where is the business case most powerful? Which industries do we need to focus on the most? Which regions of the country do we need to focus on the most? Without the data, it's hard to create an intelligent view of the full picture. And I think so. That's, I think, an area for major progress. And I think there's just a general push for more disclosure across all stakeholder performance by companies. But on racial equity in particular, it's an area where there's a lot of room for progress, and therefore a lot of room for leadership by companies who really are taking this seriously.
Thank you, Martin. One of the things I think is really important, so this is an area for us to work on, having good data to be able to make decisions. But I want you all who are listening to be clear about one thing. Do not hold the work hostage to not having the data. We can hold needing good data, developing a data agenda so that we can get it, and we can continue to do work. And one of the areas where we are seeing really good progress is on the philanthropic side. So Lakshmi, I'm going to turn to you because you've seen some really good work in philanthropy. It's one of those areas that we lift up in the CEO blueprint. So share a little insights about what we're seeing there. How are companies beginning to lead on racial equity through their philanthropic side of the house?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So, when I think about corporate philanthropy, and we'll talk about corporate philanthropy in particular, because it's one of the channels through which companies can advance racial equity, right? So companies have so many different levers, as we've spoken before: product, services, supply chain, advocacy, all of that. And philanthropy is one of those channels. And I think it is a really unique and powerful tool if used well strategically, right? So if you look at the way corporate philanthropy is executed in society today, there's a wide range. On one end, you have sort of the writing checks to many good causes, more sort of feel-good philanthropy, and then you have the more focused, strategic, impactful one where the company has identified, 1, 2, or 3 big problems that they are best positioned to address, and they're addressing that using a range of tools. The nutshell is that corporate philanthropy teams can embed racial equity in a number of different ways. There are a lot of really great resources out there that have been created largely for the private philanthropy world, but which I feel corporate philanthropy can use too. So you look at the grant making with the racial equity lens, you Google that, and there's like a ton of information. But I think just to provide some specific examples, I think there are, I'll try and give 2 examples. So one is thinking about how can you be proactive in your grant making, right? And think about who are your grantees? Are your grantees organizations that are led by people of color? Are they explicitly targeting programs focused on people of color? Is that the end beneficiary that they're looking at, right? So you take an example of Symantec's SC3 program. It's a program that we highlighted in the first competitive advantage of racial equity paper. It's called their Cyber Career Connection program. And basically it was a program that was very specifically focused on underserved young adults who are predominantly of color. And the idea was to educate them in cybersecurity and then move them to well-paying jobs. So that's sort of one way in which you can imagine doing that, to create a program that way. But then, as you were talking about, there are limitations to charity, right? And philanthropy has figured out really powerful tools, including but beyond grant making, that can be used to address those structural issues. So an example is, you can fund research that can then be used for advocating for better policies. That, in my mind, would be an example of a foundation or a corporate philanthropy really supporting addressing structural issues. So, we talk a lot about Prudential in our paper too. So Prudential, for example, has a long-standing relationship with Unidos US, which was formerly National Council La Raza. It's the largest sort of Latino civil rights and advocacy organization. And for more than a decade, I believe they have been having this relationship where they have funded really research on what is the problem, what are the biggest financial barriers for the Latino community to get access to retirement security, right? So the organization has deep-seated roots in that community, and Prudential as a funder sort of funded that research and got really good data and information. And then there've been many follow-up grants on financial coaching or advocating for policy change and things like that. So that's another example of where philanthropy has showed up in a really powerful way.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, we're right at time for Q&A. Let me take a couple of these questions because I want to get your thoughts about them. We can come back to some of ours if we have time later. This first one is a really important one, and it speaks to some of the anxiety that I have in the country right now. It says, with about 70 million American voters supporting the Trump agenda, and it's clearly a racist view of racial issues and DEI, what is the risk of corporations being targeted by these consumers? And is corporate America ready to make the changes needed to push back against this large segment of our country? And if some of you all don't know, this administration has issued an executive order that says in the government space, can't use the concept of racial equity, a lot of these types of words, can't talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, is really trying to stamp it out. And so they've made an executive order to stop all trainings, et cetera. So the very type of work that we see now corporations leading on, this administration says you can't advance that. But they're raising an important question here for corporations when you've got 70 million folks who are on that side of the house. What advice would you give corporations who may see this as a real threat? Martin, let's start.
Yeah. I think, thank you for the question. I was looking at through the questions as you were speaking, Michael. There were some really great questions and great comments, and I just want to thank everyone for that. I think that once you move beyond the political inferno that we've been through, that corporations will be looking to do, and this is our experience in our dialogue with companies, will be looking to try and do what's right across all of their stakeholders as best they can. And every company we know is in a different place in terms of their journey on stakeholder capitalism, their journey on racial issues and DE&I. And so I think one of the reasons we created the blueprint was to help companies say, okay, well, what do I do? I'm worried that I might get pushback from my consumers, or I'm worried that I'll get pushback if I don't do something. So how do I even begin to think about this in a way that is centered around the sort of, the what's best for my company and my employees and my investors. And that's what the blueprint is really meant to try and guide companies on. I don't think there's a simple answer to your question. I think, making progress on racial equity within a company is good for business, period. We've seen that in our own work. Even being more transparent and better on disclosure, gathering the data, to your previous question, we've seen companies that are better at that and proactive on that perform better in the market. So there's a very strong market incentive for leadership. And I think most people, again, I go back to our polling, 70 to 80% of respondents place that issue, action by companies on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's very high on the list of things companies should be doing. And by the way, that's across political lines, that's across racial lines, it's across economic lines, regional. We find an overwhelming portion of America, when you take politics out of it and you just ask, what do you want companies to do more of and less of? What do you value when it comes to corporate performance? The country is not as divided as the question assumes. And so I have to hold on to that, and I have to believe that. And by the way, that's every year that's happened. That's not just this year. We've seen that across the 6 years of very detailed survey work that we've done. So I actually don't believe that we are as divided as this election would suggest. And especially when it comes to the way we just lead our daily lives, where we buy our stuff, where we work, where we spend our energy, where we invest our money. We kind of want very similar things. And if we can somehow find a way back to that, you know, that is the path forward. So that's, again, I hope that goes some way to answering that question, but that's sort of how I feel about it.
Thank you. You're right. There is something that we've got to tease out more. The election is showing us something, but our data is similar to yours, that we have a lot more in common, and that folks in this country actually do want to see progress on race. And that brings us to thank you, William, for that question. This brings us to a question from Vincent in Kenya. Lakshmi, this is the question to your audit. Says, I'm listening from Kenya. I'm wondering whether the audit's historical approach will burden people in the present who perceive systemic injustice as being remote, considering that all official racist policies have been expunged. And so this is a really important one, because you're seeing this belief that we're actually talking about something that doesn't exist in the present. How do you respond to Vincent? Give him some help here.
Yeah, I'll just say two things. I think one is that and Michael, you probably will be able to add to what I'm saying much better. I think there are two things. One is, I think the effects of those historical policies, even if they have been overturned, you can still see the effects of that today. So that's number one. So it's sort of premature, and the job is only half done by just sort of not looking at that. The second thing I will say is, even today, we know that there are tons of policies and practices that may not be super as explicitly racist, but if you think of the iceberg metaphor and the big part of the iceberg below the water, like there are a lot of policies that are existing today, that are being formulated today, that are very much still very much racist, and it is because of things about like who's in power, who's making those decisions, and who is considering the end beneficiaries of those decisions. So it's very much happening even today, which is why we are seeing companies also make mistakes, right? There are a lot of companies you see make mistakes and then they apologize. You see that happening all the time, even today. And so I just think that it's about good discipline and practice that needs to be there, not being afraid of that burden. I think the burden comes from, and this is not, to the person asking the question, I think the burden comes from some fragility in actually acknowledging and accepting that that's happened, right? And if we look at this objectively, I think it is a burden, but hopefully it's not a personal. It's not personal, but it's something that we're doing for that 100 million that you spoke about.
That's right, and I will signal that the reality is anti-Black racism is still quite strong in the United States and around the globe, and if that is true, then it's totally reasonable to assume that there will be anti-Black policies in place. And in the United States, there are a lot of examples. That's why I led with that example around Florida, because that didn't happen years ago. That happened within the last 2 or 3 years. Recently, one of the largest banks in the United States, again, redlining, discriminating, and had their hands slapped about it. If you look at what's happened with our election, in Black and brown communities, mailboxes being removed, my grandmother having to stand in line for 7, 8, 9, 10 hours to vote. That's what anti-Black racism looks like. That's not happening in other communities. And so this is what I mean when I say it's hiding in plain sight, because we really don't talk about race. We don't see it. So this is where I want us all to think about. What does systems of oppression look like? Maybe not in our neighborhoods, but just right down the street. Another good example is if you look at the Department of Justice's Ferguson report around the Michael Brown shooting. What you saw is a municipality who chose to finance itself, generate revenue by over-policing and administering fines and fees in the poor part of town, because those folks can't afford to hire attorneys and cause you the grief that other folks can cause. So a simple $100, $200 ticket becomes a $1,000 ticket to people who are already struggling. And so it is a real issue. We're asking for the audit to be done in many ways because that reckoning hasn't happened, and it still continues today. So just begin to explore and see what you see, because I guarantee you, if you look, you are going to find how our institutions are harming folks. And there's a really good book now that's out that is important to read if you were to say, well, hey, I'm white, I don't have anything to do with this. Read the book Dying of Whiteness. It will show you how anti-Black racism now has white male mortality rates increasing, actually in some cases faster than Black men. In most instances, we would be calling this a national health crisis, and we are not yet. And I think that's tragic. And so what you're beginning to see is the design of this nation is too toxic for even large numbers of folks who think they have nothing to do with this issue. And so that book will give you some really good data around what is happening to the white population around anti-Black racism. Got another question for you here. I think this will probably be about the last one before we begin to close. What is the best path to getting boards of directors to support and buy in to these equity conversations, and then to ultimately make the change that we want to see? I'm gonna let you both take this one because this is important. You both have been working in this area. Martin, what do you think are some of the best ways to get boards involved, to buy into this?
Well, I think boards, first of all, process of education around issues related to purpose, the whole the board sort of corporate governance, board training, the area of fiduciary responsibility, all of those things right now are being challenged and addressed by this sort of movement towards companies being much more aware of their impacts on all of their stakeholders. And so boards generally right now are going through a transition process. I would say, typically the idea that we need much greater focus on diversity at the board level, that is, as I mentioned earlier, beginning to happen, but it's very slow. So I would say education begins from peer to peer. My experience on boards and dealing with board members of large companies is a lot of peer-to-peer conversation, and education tends to happen as much informally as it does formally. And, really trying to assess what are the needs of this company? How do we think about a holistic view of the company's future? Addressing our strategies, our internal practices and policies, our role in society, the 3 levels that we described in the CEO blueprint. Mm-hmm. And how, are we setting goals for the company to achieve those things? And so if the goals of the company, which is really the responsibility of a board, of any board, are changing to reflect greater emphasis on racial equity, then it stands to reason that the board itself and board members need to understand that journey and what it's going to take to be successful. So I think that is the process by which that happens. It has to begin with overall, what is the purpose of this organization, and how are we going to get there? And that is being either a conversation that's either being forced upon boards by investors, or by strong leaders of companies, or it will come from internally, from within, as a board saying, okay, we are now much more aware of what we need to do to change. How are we going to get from A to B? How do we think about turnover on the board? How do we think about bringing in candidates who can help us, on that journey? So there is no single quick fix for that, Michael, but I do think it relates to the basic thing we're discussing here, which is the future direction of companies and corporate America, and having boards that are not just sort of able to address individual issues within a company, but lead on that overall transition.
Thank you. Lakshmi, I'm going to let you have the last word here. Anything you want to close us out on as we then turn to Bobby?
I know Bobby's going to take over. I'll just say one thing is that this is what the three organizations are working together to figure out. So there's a model case, you can have a strategic case, but I think we're also trying to figure out what is the roadmap. We're trying to, through the blueprint, we're inviting funders, we're inviting companies to help us co-develop what are standards that for racial equity that can be accepted by companies, that is co-created by companies. So that's the journey that we've just begun. So reach out to us and join us in this journey is what I'll say. And look at, you can find more information on our website. But yeah.
Lakshmi, Martin, thank you for sharing your wisdom. Really grateful for you. Bobby, back to you.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Martin and Lakshmi as well. This has been an incredibly insightful hour. I'm sorry that our time is ending here. Learned a lot, very inspired, and the journey is very important, starting with our own personal journey with this work. So we wish you continued success working together and doing the work that you drive every day to create more equity in our society. So thank you. I also want to thank Greg Hills again for being a part of our session today. And a quick shout out to the Shared Value Initiative team, Alicia Dunn, Rima Google, Georgie Eckert, Sam Wallach, and Imani Hicks for all the work you guys do behind the scenes to make these sessions possible. And thank you to you, our audience. Great questions today. So appreciate you being here. And we hope that we see you at a future Shared Value Initiative event. So thank you again.
Take care.